Mac Flecknoe, is a satirical poem written by John Dryden in 1678. It is considered one of the most famous and influential examples of the mock heroic genre in English literature. The poem takes aim at a contemporary rival poet, Thomas Shadwell, and humorously depicts his incompetence and lack of literary talent. Summary. The poem opens with a description of the protagonist, Richard Flecknoe, a mediocre poet and the king of the realm of nonsense. He decides to pass on his throne to a worthy successor, and after much consideration, he chooses Thomas Shadwell, a fellow poet, to be his heir. Flecknoe is convinced that Shadwell possesses all the qualities of a perfect nonsense ruler, making him the ideal successor to continue the tradition of bad poetry. As Flecknoe prepares to abdicate his throne, he addresses his subjects, the dull and incompetent poets who surround him. He reminds them that they must pay homage to their new king, Shadwell, and embrace him as their leader in producing senseless and poorly crafted verse. To set the stage for Shadwell's coronation, Flecknoe decides to travel to a specific location in London. The place he selects is the area near the Monument, a landmark dedicated to the Great Fire of London. This choice of location symbolizes the destruction of genuine poetry and the rise of Shadwell's inferior work. On the day of the coronation, the dull poets gather to witness the event. Flecknoe praises Shadwell's lack of wit, his poor language skills, and his ability to produce meaningless verse. He mockingly compares Shadwell to the great ancient epic poet, Virgil, asserting that Shadwell's poetry is even worse than Virgil's worst verses. As the ceremony continues, Flecknoe places a symbolic crown of bays on Shadwell's head, an allusion to the traditional crowning of poets with laurel wreaths. He then delivers a speech that further emphasizes Shadwell's incompetence and lack of talent, extolling him as the new ruler of nonsense. The poem concludes with a warning to the readers about the dangers of bad poetry and its potential to corrupt the literary world. Dryden suggests that the rise of unskilled poets like Shadwell could lead to the decline of genuine poetic art, urging the audience to appreciate and support true talent in literature. In essence, Mac Flecknoe is a brilliant piece of satire that mocks not only Shadwell but also the literary trends and standards of the time. Dryden cleverly uses the mock heroic form to ridicule his rival and make a larger statement about the state of poetry and literature in his contemporary society. The poem, Mac Flecknoe, is a satirical mock heroic verse written by John Dryden in 1678. It was penned as a response to his contemporary, Thomas Shadwell, a rival poet known for his mediocre and unimpressive literary work. In the poem, Dryden humorously portrays Shadwell as the heir to the throne of nonsense, a realm where bad poetry reigns supreme. Introduction. The poem begins by introducing the central figure, Richard Flecknoe, a minor poet known for his lackluster verses. Flecknoe is depicted as the ruler of the realm of nonsense, a place where bad poets and uninspired verse thrive. As he approaches old age, Flecknoe decides to appoint a successor to take over his throne. Selection of the heir. After much consideration, Flecknoe chooses Thomas Shadwell as his heir. Shadwell, another poet of little talent, is seen as the ideal candidate to continue the tradition of producing terrible poetry and nonsense. Flecknoe believes that Shadwell possesses all the characteristics necessary to maintain the kingdom of bad verse. Address to the dull poets. Flecknoe gathers the other dull and inept poets who surround him and addresses them. He instructs them to acknowledge and embrace Shadwell as their new king, paying homage to his lack of wit and his ability to produce nonsensical and poorly crafted poetry. The location of the coronation. Flecknoe decides to hold Shadwell's coronation in a specific location in London. He chooses an area near the Monument, a structure erected to commemorate the Great Fire of London. This symbolic location represents the destruction of genuine poetry and the rise of Shadwell's inferior work. Shadwell's coronation. On the day of the coronation, the dull poets gather to witness the event. Flecknoe praises Shadwell's inadequacies and extols his lack of literary talent, presenting him as the embodiment of all that is wrong with the world of poetry. Comparison to Virgil. Flecknoe mockingly compares Shadwell to the great ancient epic poet, Virgil. He claims that Shadwell's poetry is even worse than Virgil's worst verses, further emphasizing Shadwell's incompetence. The crown of bays. During the ceremony, Flecknoe places a crown of bays laurel on Shadwell's head, a symbol of poetic honor. However, in Shadwell's case, the crown represents a mockery of genuine poetic achievements. Flecknoe's speech. Flecknoe delivers a speech in which he praises Shadwell's lack of wit, talent, and originality, declaring him the rightful ruler of nonsense. This speech serves to underscore Shadwell's inadequacy and the decline of poetic standards in their contemporary literary world. Warning to the readers. The poem concludes with a warning from Dryden to the readers. He cautions against the dangers of embracing bad poetry and unskilled poets like Shadwell, as it may lead to the degradation of genuine poetic art. In summary, Flecknoe is a masterful piece of satirical writing by John Dryden. It employs the mock-heroic style to ridicule Thomas Shadwell and critique the prevailing literary trends and standards of the time. The poem's wit and clever wordplay make it a classic example of satirical literature in English literature. Richard Flecknoe, Flecknoe. Richard Flecknoe, often referred to as Flecknoe, is the main character and the reigning king of nonsense. He is a fictional representation of the mediocre poet Richard Flecknoe, known for his uninspired and dull verses. In the poem, Flecknoe is depicted as a worn-out and aging poet who decides to choose a worthy successor to inherit his throne in the realm of bad poetry. Character traits. Mediocre poet. Flecknoe is known for producing mediocre and unimpressive poetry, lacking any real talent or creativity. Self-awareness. Despite his lack of poetic skill, he recognizes that he is not fit to continue as the ruler of nonsense and thus decides to appoint a successor. Sense of humor. Flecknoe has a keen sense of humor, and he finds amusement in the absurdity and ineptitude of his fellow poets. Thomas Shadwell. Thomas Shadwell is the chosen heir of Flecknoe and the central target of the poem's satire. Shadwell was a contemporary rival poet of John Dryden, known for his own mediocre works. Dryden uses Shadwell as a representation of everything that is wrong with the literary world of his time. Character traits. Untalented poet. Shadwell is portrayed as an untalented poet with a lack of wit and creativity, producing senseless and poorly crafted verse. Lack of originality. He is shown as heavily borrowing from other poets and lacking any originality in his works. Mediocrity. Shadwell's poetry is depicted as being far inferior to even the worst verses of great poets like Virgil. Ambition. Despite his lack of talent, Shadwell aspires to be a successful poet, which adds to the irony and humor of the poem. Other characters. While the focus of the poem is on Flecknoe and Thomas Shadwell, there are other minor characters present as well. These characters are the dull poets, who surround Flecknoe during Shadwell's coronation. They represent the larger group of unskilled and uninspired poets that thrive in the realm of nonsense. Overall, the characters in Flecknoe serve as satirical representations of the literary scene of the time. The poem humorously critiques the lack of talent and originality in certain poets, using these characters to make broader commentary on the decline of poetic standards in contemporary society. Flecknoe is a brilliant and influential satirical mock-heroic poem written by John Dryden. It is widely regarded as one of the finest examples of the mock-heroic genre in English literature. The poem is both a scathing critique of Thomas Shadwell, a rival poet of Dryden, and a broader satire on the state of poetry and literary standards in Dryden's contemporary society. Here is a deeper analysis of the poem. Mock-heroic style. The poem follows the mock-heroic style, a literary genre that uses the elevated language and conventions of epic poetry to satirize trivial or mundane subjects. In Flecknoe, Dryden humorously elevates the unremarkable figure of Thomas Shadwell, presenting him as a heroic figure in the realm of nonsense. The poem employs grandiose language and epic imagery to ironically praise Shadwell's lack of poetic talent, drawing attention to the absurdity of the situation. Satire on Shadwell. The central focus of the poem is Thomas Shadwell, portrayed as Flecknoe's chosen successor and the king of nonsense. Dryden mercilessly satirizes Shadwell's lack of poetic skill, originality, and creativity. He repeatedly emphasizes Shadwell's mediocrity and incompetence, comparing him unfavorably to great poets like Virgil. By presenting Shadwell as a grandiose but unworthy figure, Dryden exposes the pretensions and flaws of certain contemporary poets. Critique of the literary scene. Beyond the personal satire on Shadwell, Flecknoe serves as a broader critique of the state of poetry in Dryden's time. Dryden uses the poem to express his concerns about the decline of literary standards and the rise of mediocre poetry. The poem reflects the frustration of talented poets like Dryden, who saw their craft being overshadowed by less deserving and less skilled writers. Use of allusions. Dryden skillfully incorporates various literary and historical allusions in the poem. The most prominent allusion is the comparison of Shadwell to the great Roman epic poet, Virgil. By doing so, Dryden magnifies Shadwell's lack of talent and presents it as an affront to the poetic tradition. These allusions add depth to the poem and highlight the stark contrast between Shadwell's pretensions and his actual abilities. Humor and irony. Flecknoe is characterized by its sharp wit, humor, and irony. The juxtaposition of lofty language with the subject matter of bad poetry creates a humorous effect throughout the poem. Dryden's clever wordplay and satirical tone contribute to the overall effectiveness of the poem as a work of biting critique and entertainment. Legacy and influence. Flecknoe has had a lasting impact on English literature. It set the standard for mock heroic poetry and inspired many later satirical works. The poem's themes of literary rivalry, poetic talent, and the dangers of mediocrity continue to resonate with readers and writers alike. In conclusion, Flecknoe is a masterful satirical poem that skillfully mocks Thomas Shadwell and the state of poetry in 17th-century England. It showcases Dryden's wit, keen observation of human foibles, and his ability to employ the mock-heroic genre to make a powerful and lasting critique of the literary world. Flecknoe explores several themes through its satirical lens. These themes shed light on the nature of poetry, the decline of literary standards, and the consequences of mediocrity in the realm of arts. Here are the main themes of the poem. Mediocrity and lack of talent. The central theme of Flecknoe is the depiction of mediocrity and the lack of poetic talent in certain writers. Thomas Shadwell, the chosen successor of Flecknoe, embodies this theme. Dryden uses Shadwell's character to satirize poets who achieve fame and success despite producing subpar and uninspired works. The poem serves as a critique of the prevailing literary scene and highlights the danger of elevating mediocrity over genuine talent. Decline of literary standards. Dryden expresses his concern about the decline of literary standards in his contemporary society. By presenting Shadwell as the new king of nonsense, Dryden laments the state of poetry, where shallow and poorly crafted verses gain popularity over true poetic excellence. The poem serves as a call to preserve and uphold the traditional values of poetry and to resist the rise of superficial and empty verse. Satire and ridicule. Flecknoe is a prime example of satire, a literary technique used to criticize and ridicule human follies and vices. Dryden employs satire to expose the absurdity of the literary world and to mock those poets who lack genuine talent and originality. The use of mock-heroic language adds an additional layer of irony and humor to the poem, making the satire even more effective. Literary rivalry. The poem reflects the personal rivalry between John Dryden and Thomas Shadwell. Dryden was a respected and accomplished poet of his time, while Shadwell was his contemporary rival known for his mediocre works. Flecknoe serves as Dryden's response to this rivalry, with Shadwell becoming the subject of Dryden's sharp critique. The poem highlights the competitive and sometimes contentious nature of the literary world. Appreciation of genuine artistry. Through the satire and ridicule, Flecknoe also emphasizes the importance of appreciating genuine artistry and talent in literature. Dryden champions the value of true poetic skill and originality, underscoring the need to recognize and support talented poets who contribute meaningfully to the art form. Consequences of pretentiousness. The poem warns against the dangers of pretentiousness and the consequences of claiming expertise in an area where one lacks genuine talent. Shadwell's coronation as the king of nonsense exposes the folly of those who aspire to greatness without possessing the necessary skills and abilities to back their claims. In summary, Flecknoe delves into themes of mediocrity, the decline of literary standards, satire, and the consequences of pretentiousness. Through its clever use of satire and mock-heroic style, the poem delivers a biting critique of certain poets of the time while also making broader statements about the nature of poetry and the importance of genuine artistic talent. Artistic legacy and succession. The poem touches on the idea of artistic legacy and succession. Flecknoe, as the king of nonsense, seeks to pass on his throne to a worthy successor who will continue the tradition of bad poetry. This theme raises questions about the responsibility of established artists to nurture and promote genuine talent in the next generation. Influence of patronage and favoritism. Flecknoe subtly comments on the influence of patronage and favoritism in the literary world. Shadwell's rise to the throne of nonsense is partly attributed to his association with Flecknoe, suggesting that some poets gain prominence not solely on the basis of their talent but through their connections and alliances. Nature of poetic inspiration. The poem indirectly explores the nature of poetic inspiration and creativity. While Shadwell is depicted as lacking genuine talent, the contrast with the great poets like Virgil implies that true poetic genius is a rare and divine gift. Dryden may be suggesting that poetic inspiration and brilliance cannot be manufactured or imitated, it is something innate and transcendent. Role of satire in literature. As a satirical work, Flecknoe also reflects on the role and power of satire in literature. Through his biting critique of Shadwell and the literary scene, Dryden demonstrates how satire can be a potent tool for exposing the flaws and follies of society. The poem shows how satire can be both entertaining and thought-provoking, sparking discussions and challenging established norms. Critique of literary imitation. The poem indirectly addresses the issue of literary imitation. Shadwell is depicted as a poet who borrows heavily from others, lacking originality in his works. By highlighting this aspect, Dryden critiques poets who imitate the styles and ideas of great writers without adding anything new or meaningful to the literary tradition. Vanity and self-importance. Through the exaggerated praise of Shadwell's lack of talent, Flecknoe also satirizes vanity and self-importance. Shadwell's coronation as the king of nonsense highlights the absurdity of those who inflate their egos and overestimate their abilities, drawing attention to the folly of hubris. In conclusion, Flecknoe delves into a wide range of themes, including the nature of poetry, the decline of literary standards, the role of satire, and the consequences of vanity and pretentiousness. Through its wit, humor, and keen observations, the poem offers a multifaceted exploration of the literary world of Dryden's time and continues to be celebrated for its timeless themes and masterful satire. Flecknoe is indeed a brilliant and influential satirical poem, but it is not without its criticisms and controversies. Here are some points to critically examine the poem. Personal animosity. One criticism of Flecknoe is that it is driven by personal animosity between Dryden and Shadwell. The poem seems to be primarily motivated by Dryden's desire to attack and belittle his rival poet rather than offering a nuanced critique of the literary scene. While satire often targets specific individuals, the intensity of Dryden's attack on Shadwell has led some to question the poem's fairness and objectivity. Ethical implications of mockery. The poem's use of mockery and ridicule raises ethical questions. Some argue that satire, especially when directed at individuals, can be mean-spirited and hurtful. Flecknoe employs scathing language to demean Shadwell, and this approach may be seen as crossing the line between criticism and personal attack, potentially damaging Shadwell's reputation and causing harm. Selective satire. Although Flecknoe criticizes Shadwell's lack of talent, it doesn't delve into the broader social and cultural factors that may have contributed to the rise of mediocrity in the literary world. The poem mainly targets Shadwell, leaving out a more comprehensive examination of the societal forces that might have led to the prominence of uninspired poetry. Inconsistent standards. While Dryden critiques Shadwell for being a mediocre poet, he himself had written plays and works that some critics considered to be less than exceptional. Some argue that Dryden's own works are not above the kind of mediocrity he ridicules in Shadwell, which raises questions about the consistency of his standards. Impact on Shadwell's reputation. The poem's influence and popularity have led to Shadwell being remembered primarily as the subject of Dryden's satire. This overshadowing of Shadwell's other works and achievements might be seen as an unfair consequence of Flecknoe, which may not accurately represent the full scope of Shadwell's literary career. Limited social commentary. While Flecknoe satirizes the state of poetry and literary mediocrity, some critics argue that it doesn't offer a broader social or political commentary. The poem focuses narrowly on the literary realm, and its impact may be limited to the realm of literary criticism without broader implications for society or culture. Despite these criticisms, Flecknoe remains a significant work of satire and a classic example of the mock heroic genre. It showcases Dryden's skill as a satirist and his ability to use language and irony to deliver powerful critiques. While the personal animosity and ethical concerns raised by the poem are worth acknowledging, its enduring influence and wit continue to make it a compelling and thought-provoking piece of literature.